Okay, we're good. All right. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us on the Red Team track. I'm delighted and privileged actually to be able to introduce Dave Kennedy, who's going to do the talk on the red pill or the blue pill. Dave is a long-time friend of the Many Hats Club. We've done some work in raising some money, and after he kindly donated some DerbyCon tickets a couple of years ago, and of course he's been on our podcast and has done some awesome work with us. So Dave Kennedy, thank you, welcome, and it's been a privilege to have you here. The floor is yours.
I'm just messing with you. It's really unmuted. Sorry. No, thanks for having me, Stu, and appreciate everybody at the Many Hats Club for having me on here and for what you're doing with Isolation Con. This is really awesome. Great for the donations that you're doing, the charity events. I mean, it's just incredible what you all have been able to accomplish. So thanks again for having me. I'm humbled to be here, and thank you all for tuning in and listening to me talk today. Just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Dave Kennedy. I've been in the security space now for 20 years. 20 years sounds like a really long time. I don't feel like I'm that old. But I started off my career working for the military intelligence side. Got out and I was a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company for a number of years. And then started my own two companies, Trusted Tech and Pioneer Defense. And we have folks all over the globe now. We have folks in the UK and in Australia, in Norway. It's pretty cool to see how we've all kind of grown and expanded, and just a great group of folks. I'm the author of the Social Engineer Toolkit, the Magic Unicorn, Pen Testers Framework. I like to do a lot of open source projects. I'm on the news quite frequently. Most of these pictures that you see here, I'm not wearing pants in. I prefer to I'm not wearing pants right now. And it's just the way that I can stay comfortable and continue to present. But I really appreciate everybody coming in today to talk today. So the red versus blue pill. When you look at how the industry has really changed over the past few years, and I'm going to show you some. I like to keep my talks a combination of both forward thinking, but also technical as well. So I'll have live demonstrations and things like that throughout this presentation. But one thing that that's changed quite a bit is that over the past few years, when you go back 10 years. Our way that we look at how we attack organizations has changed. Our techniques have changed. It's no longer, as easy as it was before in many cases. Some companies are still very easy. But the big thing that happened about 5 to 6 years ago, is that our mentality around how we look at organizations being compromised changed. Every organization probably has a vulnerability management program, at least most of them do. And that vulnerability management program is far from perfect. Most companies are still just looking at the network and operating system layer, little to no visibility in the middleware and application tier. Some companies do, some companies don't, most of them don't. And so you look at that and you say, well, do you have a good understanding of your assets, your new technology that's coming in place? And I always make the joke when I'm presenting live is, does everybody here know all of the applications in their environment, what they do, its importance to the business, the information that's contained on there, or new pieces of technology that are being introduced in your environment every day? And usually the audience laughs because technology moves at such a rapid rate within our organization that getting a handle on that with the amount of resources that we typically have in security is very difficult to accomplish, even in IT. You have shadow or rogue IT groups out there. You have, different business units purchasing cloud applications. There's a lot of data flying all around, and our ability to control that is really difficult. I'd like to look back about 10 years ago when our whole mentality before we really pushed forward to the cloud. We were still using cloud services, just called something different, was more so about building a castle mentality, right? Having the heavily fortified walls and archers and drawbridges, our DMZs, to protect against attackers compromising our internal network. And that was an okay mentality. The problem is that, we still left our windows open, our doors open, our drawbridges were open. And then we moved to the cloud, and then we moved to BYOD and all these other things that started to occur. And all this stuff just opened wide up. And now we have an attack surface that spans not just our internal network or our DMZ or our perimeter devices. It also spans out to cloud infrastructure. It spans out to our users. Look at work from home. I was just doing an assessment the other day, doing a red team engagement. And what was really easy to identify is we were going through and we did some open source intelligence gathering. We found legitimate credentials. We were able to brute force through Office 365 to find legitimate credentials. And this company, when we had tested them last year, had two-factor authentication over their Citrix environment. And so we were kind of poking around trying to figure out where we could use credentials without two-factor authentication. And we just decided, with previous knowledge, hey, we probably even shouldn't test right away the Citrix environment for two-factor authentication because we already know that it has it in the first place. And what was interesting is, we're sort of poking around different websites trying to find application flaws. And we just decided, hey, we're at a point now we want to test the Citrix login. So we log in with Citrix. And because they had to go to a work from home strategy and it was too complex for all of their users, they removed two-factor authentication. And all of them had Citrix provisioned desktops or assets that we were able to authenticate to and essentially have full desktop access to their internal network. And network segmentation was a problem as well. And we were able to ultimately compromise them because of this specific area. So data's all around. And we know that in our enterprise and our organizations, we're going to have vulnerabilities and exposures that attackers can exploit, whether that's through a human being, whether that's through phishing, remote code execution, or a application that we didn't secure, whether it has SQL injection or remote command execution. There's a lot of plethora of things that we try to do the best that we can to address them, but it's not a perfect system. We're never going to have a perfect ecosystem where we have no vulnerabilities or exposures. Another good example, the past 12 cloud security engagements I've been on, I've compromised 11 of them. And it's usually due to complete misconfiguration management and not understanding how cloud infrastructure is actually set up or how to manage it or maintain it. And so again, we're going to have these exposures out there. 10 years ago, I remember going in and doing a penetration test for a company or for all companies that I did assessments for. And you go in and you try to communicate to them that, hey, the vulnerabilities themselves are important. You should address those. But you should also look at how we got in and what we did past them. And that was really hard for companies to really understand because, they were like, well, we have this buffer overflow here. We have this SQL injection here. We have, an Apache Tomcat instance default over here. We have, a SQL credential over here. All of these things are things that we have to address and patch. So they would go ahead and patch it. And then the next year we'd come in and just destroy them a different way because they would have, another vulnerability or another exposure in a different area that had transpired over that past year. And so companies were really focusing on remediate the findings of the technical issues that were identified during these simulations. And what's really changed, and this is why, you look at the evolution of red teaming and why red and blue working together is such an important concept, is that when you look at what has distinctly changed is that we recognize as an industry, and we're communicating this better now, that we will have vulnerabilities and exposures, whether it's a human being or whether it's a technical vulnerability, we will have specific exposures. There's no question about that. What happens in the event that does occur, that an attacker exploits our weaknesses or gets around our preventative controls or hits us with an O-Day or hits us with a user account and they get around our antivirus or our EDR products? What happens at that point in time? And when you look at these large breaches, you look at the Marriott Starwood data breach that spanned for multiple years. And you look at these breaches, they're lasting several months to several years before they actually identify an attackers on the system. And so our view really changed in the sense of, instead of looking at it from the initial access when a attacker circumvents all of our technology that we have in place to protect, let's look at all of the phases of an attack, everything from initial access all the way to things like privilege escalation or getting credentials off of a system, moving to lateral movement, post-exploitation scenarios, exfiltration of data, and start to build either preventative controls or detective controls in those individual areas. So again, spanning the life cycle of an attack, because we recognize an attacker is typically going to follow a number of steps to get access to the data they need. So if I compromise Bob in sales doesn't typically have the level of access that I need or the level of data that I need for my specific objective, whether that's ransomware and getting to the backups, whether that's organized crime and getting access to intellectual property or other things, whether that's nation states and going after your trade secrets or communications, whatever it ends up being, the objectives that we have to accomplish from an attacker's perspective are usually not in the initial foothold stage when we actually compromise. So our mindset shifted, saying we're going to have vulnerabilities, we're going to have exposures. Let's look at how we can detect or prevent specific attacks throughout the entire life cycle of an attack and minimize the amount of damage and time an attacker has in our environment. And that's huge. And I'll explain why here in a little bit. And so the current industry problem that we have is that we did focus and change our focus to post-exploitation scenarios. But the way that we're doing it now is a little bit concerning. When you look at something like the MITRE attack framework, which I'm a huge fan of, I think MITRE is a phenomenal resource. I think looking at and I'm going to use a buzzword here, and I only have water to drink, so I can't drink alcohol. But when you look at the kill chain, every phase of the attack has a number of techniques associated to it, right? And that's how they break it down in MITRE. And MITRE was really the first standard that took specific techniques and visualize them in a way that allows us to break out different phases of an attack and what our coverages are in those individual areas. And that was revolutionary to change the mindsets. A lot of people were talking about it for a while, but no one actually did it and actually put the techniques to different phases that allows us to look at how effective our coverages are. Now, it's far from perfect, right? I mean, not every single technique is in there, and that's not its intent. Its intent is really to build you out a framework that you can use in your environment where you continuously add on to it. You have different sources, you build new things into it. But I'm reminded by a talk that Jeff Moss gave at Black Hat and DEF CON a few years ago, so 2 years ago. And right before he introduced the keynote at Black Hat, he said something that really resonated with me, and I completely agree with. He said that as an industry, we talk about the tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers all the time. We'd say we're looking for the TTPs, we're looking for these TTPs, we're looking for these TTPs. What you're really referencing and talking about is you're looking for the techniques, and that's all you're looking for is the techniques. We've become a technique-driven industry, and what that means is that we're literally the 1990s of the static signature-based antivirus for techniques. We're essentially crowdsourcing signatures of new techniques that we see out in the wild, and it's very specific and it's very granular of what we're looking for. And what that means is that in order for us to circumvent that or get around it, it's usually pretty trivial. And I'll show you some examples of this here in just a little bit. But our industry is really focused on techniques. It's not focused on the tactics or procedures of attackers. And when we talk about tactics of attackers, we're talking about the behavior of attackers, how attackers go after an organization, how they compromise an organization, and the methods that they operate by in order to accomplish that. And the problem with behavior is that it's noisy. It requires people. You can't have a product that does it. You know, what's great is that we have all these EDR products out there today that cover a lot of these techniques that we see out there. Again, crowdsourced techniques that we see out there again. But if an attacker modifies or manipulates or changes these types of techniques in any way, shape, or form, they usually circumvent the detection criteria that you have in place. And that's a problem because as attackers get more sophisticated, as attackers change their techniques, as attackers change their tactics, the behavior that they operate by, that will continuously make it very difficult for defenders to identify things by automation products or products in general. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of the EDR products, you can ingest as much data as you want to in, but you actually have to have somebody that intelligently goes through them to look for weird indicators of compromises. Again, like a good example would be PowerShell exploitation. PowerShell exploitation is probably one of the most used things that we see out there today from an attacker's perspective. Again, you know, for companies that are doing good on minor detection, we've always we shifted towards living off the lands, or C# as an exploitation avenue. But PowerShell is still very effective in a number of different organizations because getting that log data and intelligently going through them is really challenging. A lot of companies will look for things like encoded command, or invoke expression, or curl32.dll, or virtual alloc, or things like that are going to be executed that are malicious. But if I manipulate or change my code so I'm not calling them in the first place, or I obfuscate how I'm calling them, we usually go largely undetected. When I talk about behavior in PowerShell, think of this as an example. Why not take your environment? This takes work and it takes people, but why not take your environment and baseline your PowerShell traffic for any time that PowerShell communicates out to the internet? Anytime that PowerShell communicates out to the internet. Now you're gonna be like, whoa. A whole bunch of stuff connects out to the internet via PowerShell. You're absolutely right. Why not look for deviation to say, well, this is normal traffic, so we're gonna whitelist this because we know it's legitimate, and this is not normal traffic, and we're gonna look for these in our environment. And you start to whittle down the amount of space that you're taking, the amount of logs that you're looking through in order to get to a baseline. And that baseline is really important, understanding your network. And what's really frustrating is that most companies still haven't implemented application control or application whitelisting because it's hard. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort. And what's interesting about that is we really suck in general in companies, not security, but just in general about standardizing our configuration management. How do you standardize your applications and then have an approval process for deviations? Application control by far is probably one of the most effective ways at combating the majority of the noise that we see out there. Should a regular user that is not a developer, that is not an IT, that doesn't have any reason to have a full-fledged programming language at their fingertips, should they even be able to access PowerShell in the first place? Is it necessary? It's not necessary to run the operating system from a regular user context. That'll be run by the operating system itself. So can we block PowerShell to regular users that don't need it? And it's not a knock on PowerShell. PowerShell is amazing. It's probably one of the most secure programming languages that is out there if you apply things like constrained language mode and lock it down appropriately. You have things like script block logging in place, which is an insane amount of data. And And so you look at that and you say, well, can I reduce my attack surface? It's no different than what we're doing anywhere else, from how users install applications, living off the lands. Does a regular user really need to use mshta.exe? The answer to that is typically no. So again, baselining our environment and understanding our behavior and deviations of that behavior. If you look at, there's a concept called the long tail. And the long tail, I did a talk with a person from the FBI, an agent over the FBI, Ryan McFarland. I gave a talk a number of years ago. This is like 15 years ago. We gave this talk. And it's talking about the concept of all of your high hanging fruit stuff. Your normal traffic is going to be pretty noisy in the larger part of the tail. When you start getting down to the smaller part of the tail, the part that's much, much smaller, you can start to look for those deviations of patterns of behavior. And again, from a detective perspective, that is really critical right now, because again, if we manipulate or change our stuff, the things that you look for when you Google regSVR32 or MSHDA, I would hope your products detect those types of things. But if I manipulate or change that, how are you identifying those edge cases in your environment where things would never typically be detected? And again, we'll talk about some of that as we go along. Most companies don't understand where their program maturity is at. And I'll talk about why you need threat modeling and why that's important. But most companies focusing on minor detection is probably one of the most important pieces. And I'm a huge fan of threat hunting. I think that was really our missing link when it came to our security operations centers. When you look at threat hunting and what it's trying to accomplish, it's assuming that we're already breached, right? It's assuming that we already have an attack on our environment. And what's interesting about threat hunting is that our security operations centers typically would stay stagnant. You'd have commodity alarms, 90% of them, 95% of them were false positives, alarm fatigue sets in, all these things that were happening on a regular basis. With threat hunting, we're looking at sources like threat intelligence. We're looking at things that are happening in the wild. We're looking at public research that's going out there, and we're looking for that in our environment, and we're building new detections to help promote a better security operations center. And so really what happened there is we fixed the broken cog in the wheel, where we're actually supplying new data sets, new information directly to the security operations center to really get them better at minor detection. And mapping to something like BITR attack is a phenomenal way to show your coverage in there, but it's not necessarily a good judgment of your maturity. I know people that are trying to flood in as many detections as possible, but again, how are you building those detections? Are you building it off of regSVR32 with a /i and an HTTP and SDR obj.dll? And there, are you building it because a regular user initiated regSVR32 in the first place, and we need to investigate that? Those are all things that we need to take a look at from a baselining and how we're building out those detection capabilities in the first place. I'd say right now, in general, the bar is still pretty low for attacking in most organizations. And not every organization. There's a lot of companies that are doing some really good stuff right now. But I'd say as a whole, the majority of companies that we do assessments for, the bar is still pretty low when it comes to how you're going after an organization. And whether that's they're still just leveraging AV. AV is the lowest bar possible. When you look at that, it literally is there and it is designed to only find commodity stuff. It is not a way for you to have good detections or visibility into malicious content. It's literally crowdsourced, antivirus of the 90s with some built-in scripting language analysis and some built-in behavior, which is really not much on the behavior side. And so, AV is the lowest bar possible, right? Now you start to look at EDRs, and EDRs are great if you have people actually looking through the data sets. EDRs are great if you actually expand on the application that you build in there, and it's not just what comes out of the box. You need to focus on what's actual to your environment, what your baseline looks like, and how you're building that out over time. And so we're going to talk about some attack customizations here in just a second. I'm going to go through some examples of it, and I'll run through some simulations here. But what was interesting about attack customizations is if you build your own, one of the tools that I wrote a number of years ago, 6 years ago, was called Magic Unicorn. And it was an exploitation framework for PowerShell. It is an exploitation framework for PowerShell. And it's probably one of the most prominent ones out there that have been used by good folks and unfortunately bad as well. And with Magic Unicorn, when I released it, I had been working on kind of like two parallel versions of it because I was writing the code and I wasn't sure which one was going to work better. And I was kind of optimizing both of them at the same time. And so I ended up going with one version that you see now in the GitHub pages and everything else. And it uses the x86 downgrade attack, which I figured out a way to identify whether or not I was running in a 32 or 64-bit operating system so that I could inject native 32-bit shellcode into a 64-bit platform. And what's kind of interesting is a lot of other tools ended up taking that as well. And when you see a lot of detections, they're directly written for the syswall 64. If they see syswall 64 being executed in the first place, it's usually a decent indicator that there's an attack. But what's funny about that is when I wrote the 2 versions of Unicorn, I published the one and I didn't publish the other. And about 4 years ago, Microsoft and a number of other antivirus vendors started becoming really, really cautious over Unicorn, running signature updates pretty much all the time. And it's funny because still to this day, the version that I didn't publish, the version that I was kind of working on that just didn't pan out as well as I wanted it to be, still works perfectly fine today. Still doesn't get detected by anything else out there today because I never published it. So if you write your own tooling, chances are you're not going to be detected in any way, shape, or form from the commodity tools that are out there, whether it's an EDR product, whether it's an antivirus product. Again, writing your own, rolling your own, definitely the best way to circumvent most of that. Now, what's interesting is if you look at Windows Defender, to get around AMSI, the anti-malware scan interface, is usually really trivial. It's usually a variable name or something that they're flagging on. And I've randomized most of it, but they'll still snag me on relationships between like 2 things coming in a row. So it's usually very trivial for me to just rewrite it a little bit and get around the detection in the first place. If we look at some statistics here, prominently executables are still by far the #1 delivery method, which still boggles my mind that we're still fighting with executables today. Again, application control would literally eliminate probably 52% of that noise. So your largest noise threshold by doing application control limits executables. If you disallow regular users from executing PowerShell, you're probably dropping that down to that 30%, 32% down to 30%. And then if you start looking at living off the lands, almost every single living off the land binary and script that is out there today that allows for remote code execution literally does not ever need to be run by a regular user account. So if you limit the ability for a regular user account to access those specific living off the lands, now all of a sudden now you have probably a 5% ratio of noise you actually have to look at in your environment. That's a huge difference from an attack surface perspective than what you're dealing with right now. Huge. All about eliminating the noise, reduce the noise, reducing what you have to do on a regular basis, and then looking for those edge cases and baselining your environment. Lock it down, preventative, then from there, focus on everything else. So here's an example of a detection today, okay? Here we have Registry 32. What Windows Defender looks for specifically in this is Registry 32 communicating out to the internet and downloading a file and using the scripted object DLL to execute this. So in this case here, Windows Defender is blocking me from running this specific command. However, if I just change this up a little bit, if I use bits admin, or I can use Excel, give it a HTTP parameter. I can also download, which will download it to the temp directory. There's a number of ways that you can download files directly on the internet. Curl's now in by default. And so you look at this, and if I use bits admin to go and download test.txt and then call registry32.exe with the scripted object and launch test.txt, that works perfectly fine. In addition, one thing that you can also do that's really easy is as a regular user, you copy the C: /Windows /system32 /str/obj.dll and copy it to your user profile temp directory as test.dll. So just renaming the file or copying the file to a different name. So I'm copying str/obj.dll to test.dll. You can just run this exact same command above here, but instead of putting str/obj.dll, you just put test.dll, and it also works and circumvents the detection criteria and the other preventive criteria within Windows Defender as well. So again, very simplistic, basic things that we can do to get around most of the preventative mechanisms that a lot of people employ, specifically Windows Defender. And this is not a knock on Windows Defender. Just in general, antivirus products are pretty much the lowest bar possible for you to be able to identify. What's interesting is a lot of the detections that we write in our monitoring detection programs will typically look for that /i, and an HTTP in there, and I'll typically look for the str/obj.dll. So if I run /i and I just have it go to that test.txt, no HTTP in there, and I rename str/obj.dll to test.dll, are you going to detect that specific area there? Or would a better detection be when regstr is ever being executed in the first place under the context of a regular user account? Here's an example of doing analysis on Windows Defender specifically. With Windows Defender, they're integrated into the anti-malware scan interface. And I wrote a tool. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. This is only one section of it. It doesn't show the rest of my process chain or my process flow for this. But Windows Defender was on a regular basis, like a weekly basis, writing new signatures for Unicorn. And so I got tired of doing it manually because it would take like 30 minutes or so of having to push a new version out. That I just automated it, and what it does is it checks out or it spins up a virtual machine. It checks out the latest version of Windows Defender, and it submits Magic Unicorn to see whether or not it's getting detected by AMSI. If it is, it automatically rewrites it for me and then submits a pull request in so that it automatically circumvents within about 30 to 40 seconds of a new signature being developed. And so basically I have new bypasses for AMSI around 30 seconds after the new signature comes out there in the first place. And the reason I wrote that is my opinion of this is that, it's such a low bar for somebody to change a variable name or a parameter name. Why, they need to raise the bar in how they're actually doing the detections for those, make the detections better, and trying to promote that in the first place. Once we actually get a successful bypass, this is actually what you'll see. You get a nice little smiley face saying, submitting payload to AMSI, nothing detected. And as part of a proper DevOps cycle, I actually trigger the shell and I get a connection back to validate that it passes in my build cycle. And then, if it doesn't, it fails, then I have to investigate it manually, which doesn't happen too often. Interesting enough too, I'll show you a quick demo here. If you can see my screen, and I'll do one really quick of Trevor C2. If you're not familiar with Trevor C2, it's a tool I wrote a couple of years ago. Works very good, and I just did some big updates to it recently. Converted to Python 3. It has it's a command and control that supports Linux, OS X, and Windows, and it has different stagers. It has a Java loader, it has a PowerShell loader, it has a C# loader, a Python loader. So you can use different formats from this. But a funny story on detections. Trevor C2 had been released 3 years ago. And in that 3-year period, there was never a signature that was ever written for Trevor C2. In just the past week or so, there was a signature written. I want to show you this really quick. And here it is here. And if I go to, one second. So what was interesting here is if you took encrypted stream, which is, so that is a variable name called encrypted stream. If you hit play here, you'll notice what happens. We get this script contains malicious content has been blocked by your antivirus provider. If you just take encrypted stream and you move it to encrypted streams, plural, we now successfully get around it. I'll show you this in a second. I'm going to run Trevor C2. And what this is going to do is, and you can specify this inside the source, is it's going to automatically go and clone google.com as an example. And what will happen is if somebody that is not a Trevor C2 client tries to connect via HTTP or HTTPS to the C2 server, it'll recognize that they're not an actual C2 client, and it'll just redirect them back to google.com in the first place. So they don't really know what's kind of happening. They just redirects back to the legitimate site in the first place. And then what it does is it actually takes AES 256 encryption and your command and control ends up being spread throughout the source of the HTML of the site that the client connects to. And then it reassembles that, and then it exfiltrates that data set by pretending to load fake images on the website itself, which is actually a AES 256 chunked up byte string that reassembles it, and you can get that data back out again. So it's really hard to actually go into text. We'll go ahead and run this now. Notice here the encrypted stream to encrypted streams makes it perfect. Notice here we get a unique SID based off of that. Trevor C2 is multi-threaded, so it will allow as many connections or servers or clients that you have connecting to in the first place. So if you have 10 machines connecting back, you'll have all of those. And what we can do is we can just type list. And we can see here we have an established connection to one of the systems here. We'll interact with that. And it jitters the communication. So, it's a random time frame of when it comes back. You can adjust the jitter inside the code as well. If I just want to run an ipconfig, it'll task it. It'll inject it into the source of the dynamic website that we fake cloned to Google. It's all contained in AES. It'll then decrypt that, reassemble it, send it back, try to load images based off of the AES encrypted chunk that it pulls out, which puts the file names in there. And then basically we can exfiltrate and have a full interactive command shell all through HTTP, HTTPS, all AES encrypted on top of that, and injected through covert channels that are very, very unique. And again, there's a .NET loader, there's a PowerShell loader, et cetera, out there available. One thing I also wanted to show really fast too is I was just recently, just a fast use case here. I was recently on a red team engagement that I mentioned on that Citrix customer. And what was interesting about the Citrix customer is that when we got access to the box, we didn't want to put a command and control in it just yet. And so we did our traditional pillaging. So we're kind of looking through internet sites, we're looking through pages, file shares that we have access to, just to see if we can enumerate the network. We're trying to stay low and slow. We don't want to drop C2 and all of a sudden be busted in a potential case. We don't know their defensive mechanisms. We know which products they're using, but we don't know exactly their monitoring and detection capabilities. And so I happened to find so I was running as a limited user on the Citrix box. And so a limited user, not admin rights. And I was going through one of their intranet sites, and I found a web.config file that contained a account for an SA account, a SQL administrator. And that SA account was a web application that was used for their site. But it was kind of like an ancillary, kind of small web application. And what was interesting is I was trying to figure out a way to connect directly to that SQL server with limited user rights. And so I tried things like OSQL, which requires the ODBC drivers, which requires administrative overrights. I was trying to use SQL, the SQL command line tools, but again, you need administrative overrights to install those from Microsoft. So I didn't have a good way of being able to leverage that pivot point, that box that I was on in Citrix, to communicate to that SA account and get access to the XP command shell store procedure, hopefully, and be able to compromise a server itself. Again, I'm trying to bridge from a regular user account directly to, the server itself. And so I wrote a tool. I just released it on Friday called QuickSQL, and QuickSQL works on Linux, OS X, and Windows. And it's and I compiled it to a binary, so you can use this, in the same type of use case. And basically, it allows you to just do direct queries to a SQL server without requiring administrative level rights. So it's an easy tool, quick tool, but it's, just to give you a quick demonstration and sample of it. Let's get my IP address here really quick. And obviously I can run this on a Windows machine. Again, no administrative rights required. And I'll just do quicksql.py and do -h. So this is QuickSQL. It's got amazing ASCII art, of course, as does any tool that has to be released at Trusted Tech has to have dope ASCII art. And this database, we'll just do blank. Username, we're going to do SA. And password, I know I'm typing in a password. It's a fake password for everybody there. So don't be like, oh, Dave just leaked the password online. Oh my gosh. It's a temporary password. And then we'll do the IP address, which I thought I have it there, but 172.16.253.128. And then we'll do the dash ports of 1433 as default. And this will establish a connection to the box itself. And we can do things like, exec master. Yep. So, we're able to use the XP command shell store procedure in this specific case, in my use case, to go and do it. And obviously we can query, the box itself if we wanted to, anything within the SQL database or different databases we could query. It's just a very simple tool, but again, doesn't require administrative overrights. One of the things that I ran into in a test, and the ability to write it and publish it out, is something that, I'm glad I can do on those specific cases. So I showed you Trevor C2. It's a great example of doing the encrypted streams piece of it. It's funny because Unicorn gets flagged all the time. Trevor C2, which is still a popular C2 framework, never got flagged until last week. And then I just wrote encrypted stream, 2 encrypted streams, and we're all set and got around that. New version was just released recently for Python 3, and actually just pushed a new version out right before this talk just to fix a couple minor things. But readily available on the GitHub site. So basics still work for most companies by far. The basics around things like PowerShell as an example still work for most companies. Living off the lands are still a new topic for a lot of companies as well. Most people aren't looking at living off the lands. Post-exploitation scenarios are still relatively easy to do. Minor obfuscation and changing that's all that's still needed. And again, that's primarily because we are a technique-driven industry, not a behavior-based industry out there today. It's really important that we start to move more towards understanding behavior and attack patterns of attackers. Again, the tactics and procedures that attackers operate by than anything else. It's so important that we change how we think. And so, most of the attacks that we see out there today are commodity ones, right? So we are looking at for some level of noise. But again, if I'm a more sophisticated attacker, I'm going to change things. I'm going to modify it. If you're using Metasploit out of the box, with Meterpreter out of the box, you deserve to be caught. Same thing if you're downloading and copying, living off the land scripts and using that as out of the box, you should be caught on those specific areas. Again, as attackers, modifying and changing your code is really important. Now, I'm going to throw a new concept out there for you. The reason why we have to move to behavior for detection is that the way that attackers are using things right now is different than how attackers are doing it 10 years ago. And the reason why attackers change their tactics of how they attack organizations is, one, because we've progressed and we've gotten smarter and we've learned more things, we new methods to go in, but also we started to get better with defense. And so attackers had to change the way that they operate by. Now, we are getting better at detecting techniques, right? I mentioned that before. We're getting better at detecting techniques. So what's the next evolution of how attackers are going to go after us if techniques are a difficult one to go through? And here's where I think it's going to be heading towards. Telling stories. And I want to tell you a story here of an attack that worked very well for me on an engagement. And the story that I'm telling is a story that I know the SOC analyst is going to see. And SOC analysts have a very tough time already as is. Alert fatigue, going through alarm data all the time, making things look legitimate. You have no idea what is. But if a SOC analyst sees Magic Unicorn, which is heavily obfuscated, what are they going to see? If that pops up on the screen as an alarm, they're going to be like, that's malicious. I can tell for sure that that's malicious because it's obfuscated, it's encrypted. But what if the story I'm telling a SOC analyst in the first place is not malicious, or it doesn't look malicious, or it looks, not really suspicious in any way, shape, or form? The SOC analyst has only a few seconds to make a determination on whether or not it's malicious or to research it. And in most cases, if you're telling a believable story, knowing that you're going to get busted, spending a little bit more time on your attack, you're going to have a tough time getting around this. And so here's an example right here that I've used before in the past. I used excel.exe to go and download a file. So if you use excel.exe, give it a website address right after that from the command line, it will download XLS. You don't have to do it from the command line, do it from the run prompt or how you're executing your code in the first place. In this case, it was a macro. Excel will go and download that specific XLS file for you directly to your temp directory. So now we have this Excel file that's in our temp directory. We're going to, the XLS file is actually a scripted object. It is not an XLS file in the first place. We're going to wait on the system for a little bit, and we're going to copy strobj.dll to schemamanagement.dll into our temp directory. Again, most EDR products, and I haven't seen an alert on this, copying a DLL and copying it to a different location traditionally does not cause an alarm or event in any way, shape, or form. So if I was using something like renaming regSVR32 and then executing that, then that could potentially trigger an alarm. But I'm copying a legitimate DLL to a different location, typically not going to generate or identify anything unusual there. I'm also going to rename company name report metrics version 2.3.xls to DLL uninstall. Again, renaming a file doesn't traditionally cause a alarm on a system that I've ever seen before. And then what I call is regSVR32, which is very malicious, right? But I'm calling regSVR32 to /s/u/i with a DLL install with schema management DLL. Now, if a SOC analyst gets that alarm with regSVR32 being called with those specific parameters, are they going to alert? Who knows? They might. They might investigate. Not alert, but they might investigate, right? Because they don't traditionally see regSVR32 in their environment. Maybe this is something malicious that I need to investigate, but maybe not. So you got about a 50-50 chance here, right? So right now we're at a 50-50 chance of being busted. How do we make sure that we don't get caught in that 50-50 chance? Well, the story that I'm telling here, a SOC analyst, the first hit on Google, when you Google regSVR32, this specific command line here comes up with the Microsoft Docs article here. And in the Microsoft Docs article, it shows, DLL install being used in conjunction with schema management and regSVR32. So in this case, what is a story that we're telling the SOC analyst? Hey, this is something being actively used by Windows. And there you go. You got your 100% clip in most cases, maybe a 99% clip that a SOC analyst isn't going to identify you or find you in some way, shape, or form. It's all about building that story. Can you build a story that a SOC analyst is going to review that is going to be difficult or almost impossible to identify whether or not it's malicious? And that's really the next evolution of attacks that we're going to see out there today. Spending some time to craft your attacks out that tells a different story about what's actually happening. Instead of obfuscation and encryption and all this other stuff that we know is going to look malicious, moving more towards legitimate behavior communications as things go along. Here's another example. I love, this is my favorite. Even if a company has like phenomenal PowerShell detection in their environment, this is one of the easiest ways to get around the PowerShell detection. So I'll do some OSINT on the company, and I'll pick somebody in IT that's a domain admin or a PowerShell, architect, or just different titles of somebody that's in the company itself that would want to run or execute PowerShell scripts. And I'll actually put in comments in the comment code, I'll put used to check AD health. This was written by the person that is a domain admin or administrator of that company. So when a security operations center or a MSSP or someone sees that the author code was so and so, I'm like, oh, this is just Bob, writing this code. That's not malicious. That's cool. I'll even put stuff in there like when I'm actually doing process injection. I'll put in the comments, I'm like, this is really an ugly hack to get this to work, but I needed to do it because of compatibility mode between Server 2008 and Server 2012 R2, as a main way for it to communicate back and forth. Just making up some random technical stuff that makes no sense. But when they actually look at the malicious code, they're like, oh, it's written by Bob, and okay, he sucks at coding. Got it. Makes sense. Don't worry about it. I'll grab big scripts online that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of lines of code, and I'll tuck my malicious code halfway through there. Again, no one's ever going to read through all of that code. They're going to scroll through it, see that it's a common tool on a PowerShell site, and then kind of skip past that. I've used a similar technique in the past 5 red team engagements, and I've had 0 detections when it comes to what they actually see. Again, knowing I'm going to get busted, knowing I'm going to get detected, and telling a different story. So why am I telling you this? The reason why I'm telling you all this right now is because the way that we do detections today is not going to work tomorrow. The ways that we're building out our programs today and the products that we're using today are not going to help us tomorrow. And it's coming sooner than later. It's already happening now, but the prevalence of this is going to continue to evolve as time goes on. We have to get better at understanding our environments. We have to get better at baselining our environments and looking for deviations. That is the only way that we are going to get better to be able to withstand this next front of attack that we're seeing out there. We have to continuously improve our understanding of our organizations. And that really comes, by the way, for continual testing between red and blue. I'm a huge fan of red and blue working together, right? When you look at the industry as a whole, the red teams have changed over the past few years. When I see people talk about like, and not to pick on Tim Eden, but Tim had a slide saying red is not special. He's right in that, in the sense that red and blue are equal in what we're trying to accomplish. When I hear people talk about, all red wants to do is go into a company and smash them and destroy them and doesn't want them to get better, they miss the complete context of why the red team is there in the first place. Our ability to understand how attackers go after an organization and how organizations need to build their threat models. And when I talk about threat models, it's understanding your adversaries, their capabilities, their techniques, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. It's about understanding who your threats are so that you can build a good risk profile around what you need to do from a defensive perspective and priority. Again, if we had unlimited resources, we really have to worry about threat models, because we could literally just build all the capabilities in the world, but we have to prioritize what we're actually doing. And so the job and the purpose of a red team is really to understand the capabilities of the blue, to understand the adversaries that are in play that would want to target the organization, and to emulate and simulate that and help them prioritize how to work together to build better defenses. And that is ultimately our goal between red and blue, is working together to build better defenses and to help prioritize what we're actually doing out there. It's not to destroy, every organization out there. It's, don't get me wrong, I love when I get a shell, right? It's like the most exciting time of my life. And, then you get, access to a system, you do privilege escalation, you're high-fiving yourself, in your own room, as you've been spending 14 hours and not showering doing, and you have all that excitement. But at the end of the day, the real excitement comes down to, this is what we were able to do, and here's the ways that you get better, right? And the most rewarding experience for me is when I go into a company the next year, and it's so much more difficult for me to break in based off of the recommendations that we were able to do the year before. That's the most rewarding thing from a red teamer's perspective, is making a company better, making it harder, more challenging for us to actively do it in the first place. And that's really the shift that has happened over the past 10 years as well, is that penetration testing isn't going on about going in and owning everything. It's about identifying as many entry points as possible for organizations to fix, but also focusing on the ladder effects. Red teaming, is an interesting concept because a lot of companies are not even designed or at a maturity state to handle red teams. If you don't have a monitoring detection program, or you don't have a way to ingest the type of data that a red team exercise actually provides, you should still focus on penetration testing. Ways that you can start to plug those gaps, plug those holes. But you really need to start focusing on how do you build out those detective capabilities that switch between the findings of those technical findings and the ability to understand how an attacker compromises an organization over a given time. And that's really where this industry needs to change and needs to move to again, is that behavior, understanding that it's not about that initial entry point, it's about everything that happens after that. Again, we should still focus on vulnerability management, we should still focus on other areas, but really our goal is to make the world better, make the world a better place, make it more defensive, capable of being defended against, and then working together to really achieve that goal. So with that, I'll open it up to some questions. I'm not sure if I need to do anything on my end, but happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Yeah, hello. I've got one question that's come in from Discord, actually. I'm listening on Discord. And by the way, can I just say, what awesome talk. Really, really enjoyed that. And live demos as well. Look at this. Pick out all the stocks, hey?
All today. And none of them failed. I sacrificed like 17 goats to the god. Yeah, there's like a whole bunch of dead carcasses of goats outside, but the demo gods were great. So
I wore my beret in honor of Dave Kennedy's previous service.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So there's a question from Discord. Rolling your own tooling, any resources or guidelines how to get started? And a follow-up to that, is this concept basically changing current code in public tools?
So the first question was resources on how to retool or how to code different things. Was that the first question?
Yeah. So the first bit's like rolling your own tooling, and then any resources or guidelines on how to get started.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of great classes out there today. There was just something recently released, and I can't remember the name of them, but if you search for how to get around AMSI on YouTube, you'll see the first hit just got released like last week or week before. It'll give you kind of like a nice tutorial around how to kind of rewrite code, how to rewrite certain things to be able to do that. For me, when I'm writing my own tools, the first thing I ever did is, I think I have the book back here. Let me see. There's a book from Apris that I picked up a number of years ago. It's ancient now. I can't find it back here, but there's another one here. There's one from O'Reilly, Head First Python. I think it's for kids. Picking up a programming language is going to be first and foremost what you want to accomplish. I focus very heavily on C, assembly, PowerShell, C#, and Python were kind of my main programming languages that I focus on. And for me, Python was the easiest to pick up. And when I would like to write new tooling, it's for a specific purpose. If I'm going after an organization and I'm really just struggling with getting code execution onto the system, or I'm struggling with a specific topic, that's when I'm like, well, hey, I need to write a tool to be able to go and do this for me. That's why Magic Unicorn was written for PowerShell exploitation. I wanted a PowerShell loader at the time. No one was using PowerShell to get remote code execution. So I needed something to be able to go and do that. So for me, it's more so, a need for a specific thing that I'm doing, which is why I released a tool. Another good example is Pen Tester's framework that I wrote, which is a way to build your own modular, penetration testing distro. The problem I was running with Kali, and this is not, Kali's amazing. I love all the folks over there. Was that a lot of the tools in the were out of date, and there'd be a specific function that I'd want out of that tool that I needed that was new. There was a new exploit coming from Metasploit, or what it ended up being. And so I wrote the Pen Testers framework so I could write, essentially keep all my tools up to date all the time to be able to use those. So it really comes out of necessity off of the specific engagement that I'm doing that I end up writing it. But definitely having a programming background really helps out a lot. And I would say I'm not a very good programmer. I like to hack code together that works. And if it works to me, that's good. I don't optimize my code. As long as it works, I'm happy with that. So, you don't have to be a stellar programmer to go and do stuff. You can just, definitely kind of just know the outskirts of it and build your own stuff with that.
Okay, I've got that was awesome. Thank you. And as a follow-up question was another question from Discord. Got any recommendations? Oh, there's loads now. Got any recommendations for languages, frameworks to move towards that are less likely to go the same way as PowerShell in terms of MS defenses, like Microsoft defenses and things like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually think that we're going back to C. I think when you build stuff from C, it really throws things from a loop, because the problem is that every application out there is written in C or C++ when it comes to like third-party applications. or C# to some extent. So, it's very different when you're writing your own tooling, your own code. When you have a C application that you're publishing that's malicious, if it's unique code, it's very difficult for things to actually identify those, especially when you start getting into code signing. If you code sign the application in the first place, you're traditionally going to get around a lot of the detections that are happening in the first place. So I think, for me, it's going to be C is kind of the main programming language that we'll continuously go back to. You still have a lot of usage out of .NET. Even though you have some injections into CLR that you have from a detection perspective, it's still very minimum, I think, in many cases. But C# will be around for quite a long time. I honestly think PowerShell will still be around for a long time. But when we're actually going after organizations that have a really good modern detection program, we've gone straight to C as being kind of our main programming language for that.
All right, awesome. I've got a question. Was that a question from you, Fat Hobbit?
It was indeed.
Do you want to ask it then? Go on, you can ask it.
Sure, I'll ask it. So, Dave,
can you read it in Stu's voice though?
That is really hard to do. So really my question was around, so we hear a lot about EDR solutions and blinky light boxes and stuff like that. I'm wondering, when you're actually doing the red teaming and you run into heavily segmented networks and hardened workstations, is that almost more effective than running into an EDR or something like Darktrace in the environment?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good question. Preventative mechanisms are always going to be better than detective mechanisms, because in detective mechanisms, you always have a higher probability or chance of false positives and somebody missing them. So network segmentation, locking down the system from an application control perspective, what a user can do, limiting administrative level rights to regular users, that is absolutely going to be substantially more effective than an EDR product in every case. An EDR product is really the fallback when you remember before I was talking about removing the noise, right? If you can do network segmentation, you can do locking down of the systems themselves of people that are on them. You're really minimizing the amount of noise that you have to deal with, because you've already locked it down from the preventative perspective. And then when EDRs come in play, is that smaller percentage, those baselines, those unusual pieces on that long tail, the smaller pieces of deviations that you're looking for, and it becomes much easier to spot those and find those than a massive environment that you have zero controls over. It's a much more effective strategy than just slapping an EDR product in place and hoping it's going to solve the world for you. It typically doesn't. Good question.
All right, awesome. Dave, I think we're pretty much almost out of time, and thank you ever so much for doing this. I really enjoyed that talk. It was amazing, and thank you for all the good things you do for the community and all the tools you've released, and sharing all your knowledge that you do on other cons and podcasts and things like this. So I think everyone here is, I can see the chat and stuff. Everyone's really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. Is there anything you want to say before you go? Anyone to shout out to, or anything you want to bring up?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming on and for having me here. It's been really, really a pleasure. What you all are doing there is such an amazing thing at the Many Hats Club. I'm a huge fan of you all and what you do on a regular basis. And again, thank you all. Hope you have amazing rest of the conference. And other Dave also is thankful for being here as well. So I didn't do the hand, but thank you all very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Really appreciate it. And awesome talk. And hopefully we'll catch you soon. Are you talking anywhere else soon? Any other cons or coming up?
I have been lately speaking at a few, but I think I'm taking a couple of weeks off, and then I'll kind of go from there. So, but I'll definitely post those out as we go along.
Awesome. Dave, thank you very much. And we've got a 5-minute break again, just over 5 minutes.